NBA DFS 2019 strategy continues. We're talking DraftKings versus FanDuel and why you should be avoiding some of the sharp NBA DFS regulars. What's up, guys? Welcome to another daily fantasy sports video. If it's your first time here and you want to become a profitable DFS player and get better at betting, start now by subscribing to the channel, but don't forget that notification bell so you don't miss anything along the way. And if you're already a Holkamaniac, you know what time it is. Smash that like button and we will get rolling. We know FanDuel got rid of dropping the lowest player on your roster this year. So in 2019, what are the differences between DraftKings and FanDuel specifically?
And then DraftKings, they've really what they've basically done in all sports, and what I'm struggling with to find the edges is they've basically priced everyone down in most sports, so you can make a more star-studded lineup. And I think the pricing in terms of the relative price is very strong. They do a great job in that regard. So basically, they've made the pricing so if you spend the salary cap, the range of outcomes for your team should be somewhat narrow relative to everyone else who's spending all the salary cap, because the pricing is efficient and they've basically priced the majority of people down so everyone can make somewhat of an all-star team. Obviously, news can change that more so in the NBA, but that's been a big factor that's been challenging. And then the big commitment on DraftKings, which we'll see if they continue to do this. They went back to late swap. I don't mind it because I'm sticking around watching NBA most nights. But if you're playing DraftKings NBA, you have to really commit the majority of your night to make sure you're making the optimal late swaps, which the top pros certainly are.
Yeah, it's mostly the turnovers that I kind of pay attention to. The full point deduction on FanDuel versus half a point on DK. That kind of makes a big difference, and then obviously the 3-point bonus as well. But with the pricing difference, DraftKings, I've noticed, has been really tough this year to figure out, just because everybody just seems to be significantly discounted. You'll see, especially big men on a given night, 5-6 centers at like the top 10 on the model. They're just slashing prices left and right. And it's usually a lot of the time, the reason I end up playing someone on DraftKings is more they're too cheap. Rather than on FanDuel, I'm playing the guys that I actually like. They're kind of more accurately priced. There's not huge discrepancies in what a player's salary should be. So that's kind of what the biggest difference I see in building lineups on DK and FanDuel. I end up on guys on DK that I don't actually like, but they're just too cheap.
DraftKings, it sounds like just like takes a little bit more time, skill just to nail that like perfect lineup based on kind of the one thing that stood out to me when kind of going through some of this stuff is just the multi-position eligibility on DraftKings. So Peter, I want to kick this to you. Like, I know you've often used multiple centers on DK just because they're simply too cheap, kind of like what Justin's been describing. Just like some of these other kind of hybrid type guards. Like, I know there's a lot of kind of nuance when it comes to DraftKings. So maybe talk about multi-position eligibility and why your strategy has been kind of towards a couple centers at times on DK.
Absolutely. Well, one other thing, Justin's talked about it a ton, but I do want to point out FanDuel steals and blocks are worth 3 points versus 2 on DraftKings. That's really, really important for certain types of players. Anthony Davis at home, gets way more steals and blocks because of the scorekeeper, and obviously he's that type of player. And there's other guys in certain spots where I really think they can get a lot of blocks or steals or whatever, and that definitely is baked into the projections. In terms of DraftKings, I mean, yeah, that's a huge challenge, right? The positional flexibility and also the ability to play multiple of these centers, which have consistently been underpriced, I feel like, for years now. It's a big challenge. And really you have to, on FanDuel, because of the, static positions, you have certain guys that are locks, and it comes down to a much more narrow range of combos you end up considering, whereas DraftKings, you can build a lot of different lineups. And I think that's really helped a lot of the tournament players identifying some of the chalk and still being able to get to a really similar overall projection, but maybe with a lot less ownership and potentially a higher ceiling. But I think the big thing to be aware of on DraftKings, if you're going to start grinding there, is preparing for the swaps. A lot of times there's news that can really change the slate, and maybe a guy's 50-50 to miss. So understanding, okay, here's my lineup if he's in, here's my lineup if he's out, and understanding what kind of swaps you want to make. So there's so many more nuances, and I do think DraftKings requires an immense amount more time to be really successful at. But if you're willing to grind it and you like watching the NBA, there's a lot of opportunity on the site.
Yeah, Justin, I mean, I think that one thing that I do want to kick to you as well, like all this like multi-position eligibility on DraftKings, like does it lead to more like overlap on FanDuel? Like it seems like to me like it might turn into like some more kind of 2v2 situations on FanDuel, not necessarily on DK because there's different directions you can go. Is that something I guess kind of made up in my head, or is that true?
No, that's very true. I mean, FanDuel, you kind of end up on very similar roster builds on a given night, and usually it's a 2v2 or a 3v3 on a lot of slates because obviously you're constricted, two per position, so it kind of leads to similar builds that way. DK, the possibilities really are endless given how many players are underpriced. You can go so many different directions, so you can kind of you're going to get very different roster builds on a given night on DK compared to FanDuel.
Yeah, it's interesting because the pricing historically has been looser on FanDuel, so you've been able to build through more stars and scrubs lineups. This year, it's kind of wavered. Like today, the pricing on FanDuel jumped aggressively on James Harden and Anthony Davis. And so some days it's tighter, some days it's looser, but their scoring system naturally with the ability to drop that one score makes it so that it's a little bit looser and you can build a little bit more stars and scrubsy. And also it makes it so that, generally you're assessing stuff simply by the position. And so positional scarcity is more of a thing where you can kind of identify, hey, there's not a lot of good plays at power forward today. Most people are probably going to use their punt at the power forward spot because they don't want to fill two roster spots with that. Whereas DraftKings doesn't have that punt. They have the multi-position eligibility. So it's not a positional scarcity thing. It's more of, a raw total projection and just getting guys to fit. And so we often talk about FanDuel in the case that you're talking about everybody relative to their position, whereas on DraftKings, you're talking everybody relative to their price. Meaning that like Russell Westbrook on FanDuel would compare to Damian Lillard and De'Aaron Fox and so on and so forth. But on DraftKings, he'd more compare to James Harden and Anthony Davis and different things because you can fit all the pieces you want usually. It's just emphasizing which ones you want on price tag a little bit more. And because of that, because there's more roster construction paths on DraftKings, you naturally at times can find a little bit more differentiation in the player pools than on FanDuel. Because you're so tight and you have to use 2 point guards, you have to use 2 shooting guards. That can get you into a little bit more of the 2v2s and the 1v1s that you run into. But in general, like basketball is a sport that is highly projectable. There's of all the sports that we work in, this is the one with the lowest error range. So this is the one where you can feel most confident in projections, and thus it has the most overlap. It's a natural thing of playing NBA DFS. So if you're playing cash games in NBA DFS, you will often see tons of lineups that are identical to one another. And that doesn't always mean that those players are working together. Sometimes that just means that people identified the correct optimal lineup on a given night. So overlap is a much bigger problem in NBA than I think it is in most other sports because the game is so much more projectable.
Yeah, I think what you're kind of saying too, it definitely is directly in line kind of with what Peter was talking about. He always ends up on DraftKings if he feels like using like multiple centers because it comes down to like a projections thing at that point, right? And those guys are somewhat underpriced, it seems like, relative to on FanDuel where you can't really have that type of overlap. So it's interesting how different both of it's almost like completely different games in a lot of ways.
I like having that flexibility on DraftKings to use all those players. I prefer it there a little bit more. I was answering a question in chat, so sorry if I missed this, but as far as like high volume players too, one thing to keep in mind, sometimes like a guy like Harden might be a little easier to fade on FanDuel just because you don't get those bonus points for him as far as like 3-pointers made, doubles, and the full negative for turnovers, can add up quite a bit for guys like him and Russell Westbrook. So those really high volume players, the scoring's definitely, it's a weird conundrum because they're easier to fit on FanDuel, but the scoring's way more favorable for them on DraftKings. So that's an interesting wrinkle between the two sites.
By the way, guys, if you've ever found value in any of my videos or live streams, one of the best ways to support what I'm doing here for free is to throw me the follow over on Twitter. And if you're new to the community, I also do a ton of content exclusive to Instagram. So if you take a few seconds, make sure you're following me over there as well. I'd really appreciate it. Is there a place for casual players in NBA DFS? there any suggestions you have for like almost like more casual NBA DFS players, like ones that are getting scooped if they end up kind of getting to that mid stakes or so in head to heads? Like it's got to be a hard sport to win if you're not really devoting a ton of time to like almost the whole day of breaking down some of these news items and being updated with scratches. So I guess is there a casual NBA DFS player route to being successful, I guess?
Yeah, I think you got to be kind of careful before you wade those waters, because like NBA, I think maybe even more than other sports, has just really, really sharp people up top that just know what they're doing, and they're playing every day, and they're pretty much in tune with everything going on, like Pete, like Hoop. Some, a lot of those guys that are just really, really sharp. So before you kind of wade in those waters, I think you really need to, work on your own process and put in the work, observe what they're doing, and kind of put in that time to really make sure that you're on the right path, and not get too ahead of yourself and jumping stakes and going head to head or matching up with some of these guys, because it's not going to go very well a lot of the time, even for myself. So, I think, game selection is really important. Just like I said, it's like playing those types of guys really, consistently every night in, night out. It's going to be very, very tough to churn out a positive ROI here. So I think it's a lot just about game selection and doing your best to just kind of avoid jumping in with a lot of those bigger names, because Pete and like I said, Hoop and those guys just are very, very on top of what they're doing.
One of the main things that people were asking when I threw that tweet out about like what kind of questions I should go through on these streams, and everyone still wants to talk game selection, bankroll management. Does any of that stuff change for you with Drew in NBA specifically? You guys mostly are MME guys, right? I want to get an idea of what you guys are playing, and then I guess some overall thoughts, I guess, for NBA with game selection.
Yeah, so my game has evolved over time. I considered myself, 2 or 3 years ago, primarily a cash game player, and a player that would make, a few handmade GPP lineups, and that was kind of how I did things. And I had such a strong return on investment in cash games that it was the way to do things. But over time, there's been stronger competition, especially at high stakes cash games, and the rake has gone up. And those games are really, really tough to beat now. And so I've spent a lot more of my time the last 2 years in particular, focusing more on mass multi-entry and still hand building a couple higher stakes GPP lineups, but really focusing on, kind of the idea of building mass multi-entry sets and taking advantage of the games where I feel like those games are more heavily populated by kind of casual players looking to be able to bing something. So it's just different. You kind of have to evolve over time. I still have a cash game player's mindset in terms of how I start approaching each slate. But by the time I sit down to actually build through my lineups, I'm more building through MME now. And I know Mike's gone through a similar transition where he was a little bit earlier to me to move away from playing a heavier percentage in cash games and move more to MME. And it's a different structure, it's a different approach, and it requires a different timeline. You have to be extremely willing to lose often and deal with that over time. And you have to be pretty patient and believe that your skill set is eventually going to translate over time. I've been telling friends and family, after kind of reviewing my 2018 in a year where I had a normal, profitable year for me, I had 3 different spurts where I lost more than $60,000 in a row.
Yeah.
And I made more than 6 figures playing DFS last year, but 3 separate spurts of losing $60,000. You feel like you don't know what you're doing when that is happening. You feel like you're a total idiot. But it's just the nature of kind of these really top heavy prize pools and how you go about stuff. So I have more of an MME focus now, but Mike and I grew up kind of grinding through cash games when DFS was, a lot easier back in the day, when you could play people and they would have somebody who wasn't even active playing in their lineups. And it was a totally different world and a totally different mindset than it is now. I still think you can grind lower stakes cash games and be successful. The higher stakes cash games, I think you need to be, pretty much the top 1 to 5% in the sport. And I think in NBA, I have been there for most of my career. I'm not sure that I'm there now. And the weight of making decisions last minute in NBA when news comes in, and when I'm trying to manage projections and alerts for our subscribers,
right.
Was one where I thought having so much of my action on one lineup and one decision was not a great, healthy lifestyle for me. So I've moved off of cash games a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned kind of how you've evolved over the years, because I feel like that's kind of happened across a lot of sports. Like these past 2 years, I haven't played many cash games at all for NFL. Obviously, we talked about a ton of cash game stuff with Peter yesterday, so I definitely wanted to dive in more to the MME stuff with you selfishly, because like that's something that like I really want to improve on in 2019. In NFL, I'm doing a lot more kind of mid to higher stakes single entry type stuff, smaller field stuff. That's where I've had the most success in NFL. Just a reminder, if you guys are looking to invest in yourself and take your games to that next level, you should be taking advantage of the live streams over on Twitch. It's a great way to get involved in the conversation and the community. And a lot of people don't realize if they have an Amazon Prime account, they automatically have access to a free Twitch Prime subscription. So with that, you get access to my premium Discord chat, as well as a bunch of other subscriber-only perks. And regardless, you're doing yourself a disservice if you're not getting involved with our great community that we have here. So follow me over at twitch.tv/Joe Holka so you don't miss the next time I go live. Since we do have Peter with us, and I definitely don't want to discourage you guys, let's just expand a little bit on what the high stakes are like in NBA these days. Yeah, Peter, I guess we'll end on this before we jump into some tool stuff quickly. Like, is there any remaining edge in NBA kind of at the higher stakes, or is it still like a lot of these guys that Justin's mentioning, and not a ton of guys really at that point where it's even worth, like, is there an edge in even you guys playing each other at this point? Like, I'm always curious the higher stakes dynamics there.
Yeah, you don't want to be playing against other pros. That's for sure. It's impossible to beat the rake if you're playing other guys and you have these 2v2, 3v3s. Like,
right,
you're both losing. There are some guys in the high stakes that show up every now and then that I like to play. So there's still games up there.
They like to get their action to Pete though. Like Pete,
I don't know about that.
Like not like fish out there to just like scoop or something, but like for us regular folk that just want that action, we can't get any of it.
It's hard. I mean, I post games every day, and basically never will I get scooped by another pro. There was one recent thing this last year where right before the end of tax season, right before the end of the year, basically, one top pro went on a heater in football and I believe basketball tournaments and started scooping literally every single person. I talked to a lot of guys who are playing at the high stakes and scooped every single person, and don't think that worked out very well for the person who ended up scooping. So
yeah,
it's a tough thing. Like, I get it at the end of the year with taxes. Sometimes there's incentive to try to run it up. But yeah, for the most part, I mean, I'm not really scooping any head-to-head games, and I don't get that many games. But when I do get them, they're normally pretty solid. And the highest stakes stuff now where there's a ton of action and it's really challenging is the three-mans. That's where the majority of the high stakes cash game action is. And there's a lot of really good players and it's a battle and there's a lot of variance and just kind of have to embrace it. So,
yeah. Steve Boyton in the chat was just saying, try and get into some three-mans that Peter's not already in. So definitely would agree. That's probably a solid strategy. We do have in a sport like MLB, I'm not sure watching the games actually helps you, but does having actual basketball and NBA knowledge help you guys in NBA DFS or no? Come from a hockey background, obviously. A lot of my content is more kind of towards NFL. NBA is like one of the actual like sports that I really don't know a ton about, I guess, in general. So do you think that helps you along the way, just like actually knowing a ton about what basketball is like?
I think it can help with certain things. I would say that, I didn't like play basketball growing up or anything. I grew up a little bit in a basketball household because my dad played college basketball, but I didn't play growing up. I don't know like the ins and outs and the X's and O's super well, but I understand the league very well in terms of the NBA itself. And I think that does help in terms of understanding some of the nuances of the scheduling and when teams might pull back on, stud players in terms of going through difficult schedules, or when teams face other teams, how they choose to attack and different things like that. But yeah, I think anytime you have a passion for the game or the sport that you're playing DFS in, I think you create a little bit of a natural edge for yourself just because you're more likely to be in tune with things that are outside of the scope of DFS. And for me, that's like understanding transactions and understanding when teams might be kind of highlighting or showcasing a player for an opportunity that they're looking forward to the future, or when teams might match up with a different team a certain way in terms of playing big or playing small. I think those things are all helpful. They're not like a primary focus, and you don't need it to be successful at DFS NBA, but I do think it helps in terms of adding some context on top of the numbers.
If you want to learn more about how to become a profitable daily fantasy sports player or better, start now by hitting the subscribe icon in the bottom right-hand corner. I have a ton of other DFS courses, not just NBA, of course. So be sure to check those out. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.